Divorce doesn't break people. The story they tell about it does. This part of the Relationship Trap series, every episode covers one way the past is driving the present in our current relationships. This is episode 18. I want to start with something that nobody told you at the time that happened. If you have been through a divorce or the end of a long, serious relationship, the pain was real. What you felt was real, but some of what you have been suffering since it isn't for what happened. It is for the story you build around what happened, and those are different things, and only one of them is changeable. Let me start with what the research actually shows. Divorce is one of the most stressful life experiences a person can experience. Research is consistent on that. It sits at the top of almost every stress scale ever developed, alongside bereavement and serious illness. But here is what the research also shows. And this is the part that most people going through it never hear. The long-term outcome has very little to do with the divorce itself. It has almost everything to do with the narrative the person builds around it. Two people can go through the same painful ending, the same betrayal, the same loss, the same dismantling of everything that was shared. One builds a story of permanent damage. The other builds a story of difficult, necessary change. 5 years later, they aren't the same person. Not because their circumstances were different, because their narrative were externally events as identical. What they did with it wasn't. Let me explain why the brain responds to this the way it does. Because understanding the mechanism is the only way to work with it. The brain doesn't process the end of a long relationship as a loss. Not primarily. It processes it as an identity collapse. The relationship wasn't just a relationship. It was a context, a social role, a daily structure, a future that was being built toward, a version of the self that existed inside all of that. When it ends, all of that ends simultaneously. Not just the person, but the self that existed alongside that person. The plans that self was going to carry out. The future that self was going to have. That is what grief is actually about. And that is why it feels so total. Because it is total. It isn't exaggerated. It is accurate. Something real has ended. The question isn't whether the grief is legitimate, because it is. The question is what narrative gets built around it. And specifically, whether that narrative is one that allows the person to rebuild, or one that makes rebuilding feel impossible. The story that prolongs the suffering has 3 specific features, and psychologists have studied these in detail. The first feature is permanence. They believe that what happened has damaged you in a way that will not heal, that you are fundamentally different now, that a version of you before this is gone and can be recovered. The second feature is pervasiveness. They believe that this has affected everything, not just the relationship that ended, all relationships, all future possibilities, your ability to trust, your ability to be loved, your ability to build something stable. And the third feature is personalization. They believe that this happened because of something fundamentally wrong with you, not the complexity of two people and relationship, but you. These three beliefs, permanent, pervasive, and personal, are the structure of the story that makes people stuck. Not for months, sometimes for decades. And research on resilience consistently shows that people who recover from major losses hold opposite beliefs, not as a denial, as accuracy. This is painful and temporary. This affects this part of my life, not all of it. What happened is complex, and I'm not the only cause. Those are not optimistic lies. They are almost always functionally correct, because the permanent, pervasive, and personal version is almost never factually correct. It has a story the mind builds when it's in pain and looking for an explanation that gives the chaos some structure. Pain looks for meaning, and the meaning it finds isn't always the accurate one. Here is the part that requires something difficult. We can choose the events of our lives. Most of us can choose when relationships end or how they end. But we can slowly and deliberately choose the narrative we attach to what happened, not immediately. Grief has a process, and that process can be rushed, and not easily, because the brain returns to the painful narrative, the way the tongue returns to us so tough. Not by choice, by automatic process, but deliberately, over time, with repetition. The question worth asking is not, why did this happen to me? That question has no useful answer. It has a question that keeps you inside the event, rather than past it. The question that moves things is this: what does this make possible that wasn't possible before? Not as a denial of the pain, not as a pretense that what happened was good, as a direction, a place to point the energy that currently has nowhere to go. Every significant ending creates a space. That space is uncomfortable. The brain interprets empty space as danger, as something that needs to be filled immediately with explanation or replacement. But that space is also real possibility. Possibility that didn't exist inside the structure that just ended. And the people who eventually described their divorce as one of the most important things that every happening to them. Not painlessly, not gratefully, but as something that changed the direction of their lives in a way that needs to happen. Aren't the people who felt less pain? They were the people who built a different narrative around the same amount of pain. That is available. It is in quick, and it doesn't require pretending. It requires asking a different question and being willing to hear a different answer. And in the next episode, we aren't thinking about our ex. We are thinking about ourselves, understanding that change everything about how long it lasts.